Hello, my name's Charles Hackett. I'm from Mayflower 400, and I just wanted to welcome you to Sporting Voyage. I hope you really get involved in this opportunity to have some fun, play some new sports, do some new activities, and also learn a little bit about Plymouth, its role, its history, its place as a maritime and Britain's ocean city, and the events that unfold from here 400 years ago in the sailing of the Mayflower, which came on to shape the whole world in which we live. So take part in 2020 and all that Mayflower 400 has to offer in that year, and I hope you really enjoy getting involved and enjoy all the activities through Sporting Voyage.
Hello, I'm Katie, and here we are down on the quay in Plymouth by the Mayflower steps, which, as you can probably see, are under wraps. They're being restored, all ready for 2020. Well, I'm here to tell you a story. I'm here to tell you the beginning of the story of the Mayflower. And I'm going to do that by telling you about a boy. I'm going to tell you about a boy called William Bradford, who lived round about 400 years ago. And he didn't grow up here in Plymouth. No, he grew up on a farm in a village up in the north of England, in Yorkshire. And, well, things were really quite tough for William growing up. His father died, his mother died, his sister died. And William himself, well, he was very sick as a child, so ill that he couldn't spend much time playing with the other children. Instead, he spent a lot of time indoors. He spent a lot of time reading. But there weren't in those days an awful lot of books about. But one book that William did have, that he read over and over again, that was the Bible. He loved reading the Bible. And he didn't just read it, he thought really deeply about the Bible. And luckily enough for him, he met some other people in his village and the village down the road who wanted to talk about the Bible with him. And William and his friends, the more they talked about the Bible, the more it seemed to them that, well, what was going on in the church in the village, it wasn't right. The priest telling everybody what to do, taking the service, everybody following, but not really understanding what was going on. Well, none of that was in the Bible. That surely wasn't what God wanted them to do. And so William and the others, they began to meet together, but they had to do it in secret. You see, about 400 years ago, things were quite different. You sort of had to go to church. And if you didn't go to church, you'd get in trouble. Not just with the priest, but with the law, with the government, eventually with the king himself. And so William and his friends, they met together in secret, in hiding. And it was difficult. It was dangerous. And so they began to dream. They began to dream of somewhere they could go, where they could worship God freely, just as they wanted to. And they heard stories about another country, a land called Holland. In Holland, there lived the Dutch people. And the Dutch were what we would now call tolerant. They didn't care if people went to church or not. They didn't mind how people worshipped God. And so William and his friends, they got this idea that they would move. They would leave England and they would go across the sea to Holland. And William himself, well, he was just 17 years old when he decided to leave. He left his farm, which he was just about to inherit. He left his wider family. He left everything he knew. And he went because he was so convinced that this was what God wanted for him. They came to a place called Leiden in Holland. Some of them bought houses and they made a kind of little community there. There was a man among them called John Robinson. And John became their minister, their pastor. But it wasn't like the priest telling the others what to do. He was very much one equal among the community. They were all working out together how they should live, how they should worship God together. A few years later, William met a woman within the community, Dorothy, and the two of them got married. And before long, they had a little child, a little boy called John. Well, in Holland, things were good, but things were still quite difficult. You see, the Dutch, they were very happy for the English to come and worship God however they chose. But they were not so happy about the English coming and taking all the best jobs. No, they didn't want that at all, and so they put some rules in place to make sure that the English could not take the most skilled, best paid jobs. And so the Englishmen found that it wasn't so easy to work in the way they had been used to. And what was also hard for them was, as the years went by and their children grew up, their children, well, they played with the Dutch children, naturally, and they learnt more Dutch than English. And, well, that was not what they'd had in mind. They wanted their children to stay English. And so they began to dream again. They began to dream of somewhere they could go where they could not only worship God however they wanted, they could live and they could work however they wanted. And then they began to hear stories of a land, not just across the sea, but across the ocean, a newly discovered land. The land of America. And when they heard of America, they thought, this is surely the place where God wants us to go and build a community, settle in this new land. And they were so sure about this that they sold some of their homes, some of their possessions, and they bought a boat. They bought a ship called the Speedwell. And the Speedwell, well, she was about 16 metres long, and she wasn't big enough to sail across the ocean by herself. They knew they needed a bigger ship to go with her, and they knew they needed a bit of help as well. Luckily for them, they still had many friends back in England, and their friends back in England helped them find a bigger ship that could go with them. And I expect you listening know the name of that ship they found to go with the Speedwell. The name of that bigger ship was, of course, the Mayflower. And the Mayflower, well, she was over twice the size. She was probably about 33 metres long. And their English friends, well, they found sailors to sail her. They found carpenters to mend her and to help them build houses when they got to America. And they also found a military man who would defend and protect them if they needed it. And William and his friends in Holland, well, they began calling themselves, the religious people, they began calling themselves the saints. And they began calling all these other people the strangers. Not very friendly, is it, making this dividing line between them, the saints and the strangers. But that's what they did. But they did also, they thought of them all going on this great adventure, this great journey together in the name of God. They thought of themselves as pilgrims. And that is what they have all together come to be known as pilgrims. Well, when everything was ready, they came from Leiden in Holland to a little port called Delfshaven. And there William and Dorothy, they had to say goodbye to their little son John. They decided that the journey was just too long and too dangerous, and so they decided to leave him behind in the care of other people. It must have been really hard for them to say goodbye to him. But there were other children who did come on board the ship. And Pastor John, he came on board the ship. He fell to his knees, and with tears in his eyes, he entrusted them all into the care of God. And then the Speedwell set sail. And she came to England. She came first to the great port of Southampton. And there she met up with the Mayflower, and the two ships set off together down the English Channel. They must have made such a fine sight, sailing down the Channel into the west, off to the New World, off to America. But they hadn't gone far before the Speedwell sprang a leak. She was not speeding well. It was too difficult to go on, too dangerous to go on. The master of the ship said they must go back. They turned around and they came back to Devon. They came back to a place just down the coast from here. I'm sure some of you have been there, a place called Dartmouth. And in Dartmouth, the Speedwell was repaired, and at last they could set off again. 100 miles, 200 miles, nearly 300 miles out to sea. Oh dear, the Speedwell was leaking again. She was not speeding well. There was nothing for it. They had to come back. And this time they came back here to Plymouth. And back in Plymouth, they decided that they were just going to have to abandon the Speedwell. She was never going to make it across the ocean to America. And so all the pilgrims piled into the Mayflower. Well, not quite all of them. Some of them had now been on board ship for nearly 6 weeks, and they hadn't even left England. They decided this was just too difficult a journey, and they decided that they wouldn't go any further. But most of them were sure that this was what God wanted them to do. And so 102 of them got on board the Mayflower. About 40 saints, about 60 strangers. Oh, and a couple of dogs, a few chickens, and probably some pigs. They all got on board the ship. They restocked with food and provisions for the journey. And then finally, on the 6th of September, 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, sailing across the ocean to the New World, sailing for America.